Dr. Emily Parker never imagined that rescuing a tiny abandoned puppy would change everything she knew about the natural world. What started as a simple act of kindness became an extraordinary journey that would challenge her beliefs, threaten her career, and force her to question the very boundaries between wild and tame. As the truth about her unusual rescue unfolds, Emily must decide: will she risk everything to protect a creature that defies explanation, or surrender it to authorities before her discovery becomes public? If you're watching this incredible story, drop a comment telling us where you're viewing from today. And if you enjoy tales of extraordinary animal discoveries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to never miss our latest uploads. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Evergreen Animal Hospital, creating a soothing rhythm that normally would have lulled Dr. Emily Parker into a peaceful evening routine. But tonight was different. She sat at her desk, reviewing patient files while trying to ignore the growing storm outside. The old Victorian house that she'd converted into her veterinary practice creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, its aged wood protesting against nature's fury. Emily had only owned the clinic for 6 months, taking over from her mentor, who'd retired after 30 years of serving Cedar Grove's four-legged population. The transition from big city vet to small-town doctor had been challenging. But nights like these reminded her why she'd chosen this quiet corner of Oregon to build her new life. A sharp crack of thunder made her jump, sending her coffee mug teetering dangerously close to her patient records. As she reached to steady it, another sound cut through the storm's chaos. A high-pitched whimper, barely audible above the rain. Emily froze, her hand still on the mug, listening intently. There it was again, desperate and weak, coming from somewhere near her back door. She grabbed her raincoat and flashlight, her heart already racing with concern. The back porch light flickered uncertainly as Emily stepped outside, her boots splashing in growing puddles. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rain-soaked garden furniture and wind-blown leaves. Then she heard it again, closer this time, a sound of such profound distress that it made her chest tighten. Following the noise, she rounded the corner of the building, and her light finally found its target. Huddled against the foundation, impartially hidden beneath a sprawling rhododendron, lay what appeared to be a puppy. Its coat was so heavily matted and soaked that Emily couldn't immediately determine its breed. But something about the creature made her pause, made her medical instincts tingle with uncertainty. Even through the rain and mud, the puppy's fur seemed to hold an unusual sheen, almost iridescent under her flashlight's beam. And its eyes, when they finally opened to look at her, were a shade of gold she'd never seen before in any canine. Breed! "Hey there, little one," Emily whispered, crouching down slowly. The puppy didn't flinch or try to run. Instead, it watched her with an unsettling intensity, those golden eyes tracking her every movement with an awareness that seemed beyond its apparent age. When she finally gathered it into her arms, she was struck by how light it felt, as if its bones were hollow like a bird's. Inside the clinic, Emily worked quickly to dry and warm her unexpected patient. As she gently toweled away the mud and rain, more peculiarities emerged. The puppy's bone structure was unlike anything she'd encountered in her years of veterinary practice. Its limbs were long and delicate, almost deer-like in their grace. The paw pads weren't the typical rough texture she'd expect, but smooth and surprisingly tough, like polished stone. "You're quite the mystery, aren't you?" Emily murmured, running her hands along the puppy's now clean coat. The fur felt like silk beneath her fingers, and that strange, iridescent quality hadn't disappeared with the mud. Under the clinic's bright lights, each hair seemed to catch and reflect the light differently, creating an ever-shifting pattern of colors that reminded her of oil on water. She prepared a small bowl of puppy formula, but the creature showed no interest. Water, however, it lapped up eagerly, its long tongue moving with precise, almost mechanical movements. When Emily tried to draw blood for basic tests, the needle wouldn't penetrate the skin. It simply slid off as if trying to pierce smooth glass. Each new discovery added to her growing sense that she was dealing with something far beyond her usual experience. Setting up a comfortable crate with soft blankets, Emily decided to keep her unusual guest overnight for observation. But when she tried to guide the puppy into the enclosure, it simply sat down and fixed her with those unnerving golden eyes. There was an intelligence in that gaze that made Emily's scientific mind rebel. No weeks-old puppy should be capable of such focused attention, such clear communication. That night, Emily made up the small couch in her office, unwilling to leave her mysterious patient alone. As she drifted off to sleep, the sound of delicate paws on hardwood caught her attention. Through half-closed eyes, she watched as the puppy moved through the moonlit room with impossible grace, examining every corner, every shadow, as if mapping its new territory. Its movements weren't those of a clumsy young animal, but of something ancient and calculating. Morning brought new revelations. Emily found the puppy perched on her filing cabinet, a spot that should have been impossible for any normal dog to reach. It descended in a fluid motion that defied physics, each movement precise and controlled. When she opened the clinic for the day's appointments, her regular patients reacted with unmistakable alarm to the presence of her new charge. Mrs. Henderson's typically friendly golden retriever took one look at the puppy and backed away, tail tucked, whining in distress. As days passed, the peculiarities mounted. The puppy grew, but not in any way Emily recognized. Its proportions shifted and changed like a time lapse of evolution in reverse. The delicate limbs lengthened further, the skull reformed into something that seemed to hover between canine and something else entirely. Most striking was its continued disinterest in normal food. Emily never saw it eat, yet it remained healthy and alert. Sarah Collins, who ran the local diner, was the first to voice what others had only whispered about. "That's no ordinary pup you've got there, Emily," she said one morning, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. "Mark Thompson, you know, the old ranger. He says he's seen things in those woods, things that shouldn't exist." Emily had brushed off the comment, but later that night, watching her charge move through the shadows of her clinic with that otherworldly grace, she couldn't shake Sarah's words. The turning point came exactly 2 weeks after the stormy night. Emily arrived at the clinic to find the local animal control officer, James Harrison, waiting at her door. "We've had reports," he said, his usually friendly face serious, "about your unusual rescue. The State Wildlife Department is interested." Emily's heart raced as she thought of the creature currently curled up in her office, defying every natural law she'd ever learned. That evening, she sat in her office, surrounded by veterinary textbooks and online research, searching for any explanation for what her patient had become. The creature, she could no longer think of it as simply a puppy, watched her from its perch near the ceiling. Those golden eyes reflecting the computer screen's glow, its body had continued to transform, taking on characteristics that belonged to no single species. The iridescent fur now rippled with colors that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of light, and its movements had become so fluid they almost seemed to bend space around them. Mark Thompson's warnings echoed in her head. "There are things in these woods older than our understanding, Doc, things that weren't meant to be caged or studied." The old ranger had stopped by earlier that week, his weathered face grave as he shared tales of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in the deep forests surrounding Cedar Grove. Emily had always considered herself a woman of science, but science offered no explanation for what was happening in her clinic. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a wildlife expert from the State Department, arrived unannounced the next morning. "We need to discuss your unusual patient," she said, her tone professional, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. There are protocols for handling unknown species. The word species sent a chill down Emily's spine. She knew that surrendering her charge would mean subjecting it to endless tests and probable confinement. The thought made her physically ill. That night, as rain once again battered the clinic's windows, Emily made her decision. She watched as her extraordinary patient moved through the darkness, its form seeming to blur at the edges, defying the very boundaries of physical reality. This wasn't just about protecting an animal anymore. It was about preserving something magical, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the natural world. With trembling hands, she opened the clinic's back door. The creature paused in its endless exploration, those golden eyes meeting hers with ancient wisdom. No words were exchanged, none were needed. It moved to the threshold, its iridescent fur catching the moonlight in ways that made Emily's eyes water. For a moment it looked back at her, and in that gaze she saw gratitude, intelligence, and something else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A glimpse into mysteries she would never fully understand. The creature stepped into the night, its form seeming to ripple and change, even as Emily watched. By the time it reached the tree line, it had become something else entirely, something that her mind struggled to process. Then it was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air and questions that would haunt Emily for the rest of her life. The next morning, when Dr. Martinez and Officer Harrison arrived with their official papers and transport cages, they found only an empty clinic and a veterinarian who could tell them nothing more than that sometimes. The most extraordinary thing we can do is let go of our need to understand. Years later, on stormy nights when the wind howls through the pines, locals sometimes speak of strange lights in the forest and a creature that moves between the trees like liquid moonlight. And in her clinic, Dr. Emily Parker keeps a single iridescent hair in a sealed glass vial, proof of a mystery that science may never explain, and a reminder that some discoveries are meant to remain free. If you found this story as extraordinary as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered something that defied explanation? Stay tuned for more incredible tales of unexpected discoveries that challenge everything we think we know. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Emily made her rounds at Evergreen Animal Hospital. Her mysterious patient had been with her for 3 weeks now, and each day brought new revelations that challenged her understanding of the natural world. The creature, she'd begun calling it Aurora for the way its fur seemed to dance with colors in the light, had grown in ways that defied explanation. Its body had elongated, taking on proportions that seemed to shift and change, depending on who was watching, as if it existed in multiple forms simultaneously. Today, something felt different. The usual morning quiet was disturbed by an unusual tension in the air. Emily noticed it first in her regular patients. The normally boisterous dogs in the boarding kennels had fallen silent, and Mrs. Thompson's cat, in for a routine checkup, had pressed itself flat against the back of its carrier, pupils dilated in obvious fear. Aurora sat perched on top of the medicine cabinet, those mesmerizing golden eyes tracking something Emily couldn't see. A sharp knock at the front door made Emily jump. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the broad shoulders of Dr. David Chen, the state's leading wildlife veterinarian. Her heart rate quickened. She hadn't told anyone about Aurora's true nature, but rumors had begun spreading through Cedar Grove like wildfire. The small town's gossip mill had been working overtime, spinning tales of strange lights in her clinic windows and unusual sounds in the night. Dr. Parker. Chen's voice was professional, but carried an edge of authority that made Emily's spine stiffen. I'm here about reports of an unusual animal in your care. Mind if I come in?" Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. Behind her, she could sense Aurora's presence, though she knew the creature had already vanished into the shadows of the clinic's back rooms. It had an uncanny ability to make itself scarce when strangers appeared. The conversation with Dr. Chen started pleasantly enough, but Emily could feel the underlying current of suspicion in his questions. He asked about her recent cases, her licensing, her protocols for handling wildlife. Each query seemed designed to trap her in an admission about Aurora. Emily chose her words carefully, walking a tightrope between professional courtesy and protection of her extraordinary charge. "We've received some interesting reports from your neighbors," Chen said finally, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Descriptions of an animal that doesn't quite match any known species. Something with unusual coloring, impossible movements." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "As the state's wildlife expert, I'm very interested in examining this creature." Emily's mind raced. She thought of Aurora's transformation over the past weeks, the way its fur had developed patterns that seemed to move of their own accord, how its eyes had grown more luminous, filled with an intelligence that sometimes left her breathless. She thought of the morning she'd found it reading her medical textbooks, those golden eyes scanning the pages with unmistakable comprehension. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Emily heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "The puppy I took in during the storm was claimed by its owner last week." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but the alternative, watching, Aurora being caged and subjected to endless tests, was unthinkable. Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Emily could see doubt in the slight narrowing of his eyes. As if on cue, a crash sounded from the back room. Chen was on his feet instantly, moving toward the sound before Emily could stop him. Her heart hammered against her ribs as they entered the treatment room. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, but then Emily noticed the cabinet door swinging slightly, and on the floor, a single hair that seemed to catch and reflect light in impossible ways. Dr. Chen crouched down, reaching for the hair, but before his fingers could touch it, it dissolved into mist, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air. When he turned back to Emily, his expression had changed from professional skepticism to intense curiosity. "Dr. Parker, I think it's time we had an honest discussion about what's really going on here." The next few hours became a delicate dance of half-truths and careful omissions. Emily described finding a strange puppy during the storm, but kept Aurora's more extraordinary qualities to herself. She spoke of unusual markings and shy behavior, painting a picture of an ordinary stray with perhaps some rare genetic variations. All the while, she could feel Aurora's presence moving through the walls and shadows of the clinic like a ghost, always just out of sight. Dr. Chen finally left as evening approached, but his parting words carried a clear warning. "I'll be back tomorrow with a team. Whatever you're housing here, it needs to be properly documented and studied." The threat in his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Emily waited until his car disappeared down the winding road before closing the door and sliding down against it, her legs weak with relief and fear. Aurora materialized beside her, its form seeming to coalesce from the evening shadows. The creature had grown again. It now stood as tall as a Great Dane, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too graceful, its movements too fluid to be entirely physical. The iridescent fur along its spine had developed patterns that seemed to move and shift like constellations in a living sky. "What are we going to do?" Emily whispered, reaching out to touch Aurora's silk-like fur. The creature turned those golden eyes on her, and Emily felt the familiar sensation of falling into depths of intelligence far beyond human understanding. Aurora had never made a sound, not a bark, not a whimper. But somehow, it always managed to communicate exactly what it was thinking. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She paced the clinic's halls, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Aurora watched from various perches, sometimes appearing in places that should have been physically impossible to reach. The creature's presence had changed the very nature of her clinic. Shadows didn't fall quite right anymore, and sometimes rooms seemed larger on the inside than they should be. Near midnight, a knock at the back door made Emily's heart stop. She approached cautiously, Aurora materializing at her side like a protective shadow. Through the window, she could make out the weathered face of Mark Thompson, the old ranger. She'd been avoiding him since Aurora's arrival, knowing his reputation for understanding the stranger aspects of the forest better than anyone. "Evening?" "Doc," Mark said when she opened the door, his eyes immediately finding Aurora in the darkness. Unlike others who saw the creature, he showed no fear or surprise. Instead, a look of profound respect crossed his face. "I figured it was time we talked about your guest. There are things you need to know, things about these woods and what really lives in them." Mark settled into a chair in Emily's office, his ranger's uniform worn and faded from decades of service in the forest. Aurora positioned itself between them, its form seeming more fluid than ever in the low light. "What you've got here," Mark began, his voice low and serious, "isn't just some unusual animal. It's something much older, much more significant. The local tribes have stories about creatures like this, beings that exist between worlds, that take forms we can almost understand but never quite grasp." Emily listened, spellbound, as Mark shared tales passed down through generations of forest service workers and local indigenous people. He spoke of lights in the deep woods that moved with purpose, of animals that defied classification, of places where the boundaries between what was real and what was possible grew thin. With each word, pieces of the puzzle that was Aurora began falling into place. "They appear every few generations," Mark explained, his eyes never leaving Aurora's shifting form. "They choose someone to reveal themselves to, someone who can help them understand our world as they help us understand theirs. But they never stay long, Doc. They can't. Their very presence begins to change the fabric of reality around them." As if to illustrate his point, Emily noticed that the shadows in her office had begun moving independently of any light source, and the walls seemed to pulse gently, like a sleeping creature's breathing. Aurora's fur had taken on a luminescence that filled the room with soft, impossible colors. "The government types will be back," Mark warned, standing to leave, "and they won't stop until they get what they want. You need to decide what's more important, satisfying their curiosity or protecting something extraordinary." He paused at the door, looking back at Aurora with a mixture of awe and sadness. "Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, Doc. Some wonders need to stay wonderful." After Mark left, Emily sat in the growing darkness, watching as Aurora moved through the clinic with increasing ethereality. The creature's form had become less solid, more suggestive of shape than actually possessing one. Its fur now resembled the aurora borealis more than any earthly material, and its movements left trails of light in the air that lingered like after-images. The decision crystallized in Emily's mind as she watched Aurora interact with its environment in increasingly impossible ways. The creature was no longer even pretending to be bound by physical laws. It walked on air, passed through solid walls, existed in multiple places simultaneously. Keeping it here, trying to protect it from discovery, was like trying to hide a star in a paper bag. Tomorrow would bring Dr. Chen and his team, armed with their scientific instruments and rational explanations. They would try to quantify and categorize something that defied the very concept of classification. Emily knew now that she couldn't let that happen, not just for Aurora's sake, but for the sake of wonder itself. In the deepest part of the night, Emily began making preparations. She gathered the few physical traces of Aurora's presence, the impossible hairs, the strange markings it had left, the photos she'd taken that never quite came out right. Each item seemed to dissolve as she touched it, as if the very evidence of Aurora's existence was returning to whatever realm it had come from. The creature watched her work with those knowing golden eyes, its form growing increasingly luminous. As the night wore on, Emily could feel a change coming, something momentous approaching with the dawn. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Just before sunrise, with the first hints of light touching the eastern sky, Emily opened every door and window in the clinic. She stood in the center of her office, surrounded by the gentle chaos of floating papers and swirling shadows that always accompanied Aurora's more dramatic movements. The creature approached her one last time, its form now more light than substance, more idea than physical reality. "Thank you," Emily whispered, though she knew words were inadequate for what she really wanted to express. Aurora touched its muzzle to her hand, and in that moment, Emily understood everything: the nature of wonder, the importance of mysteries, the beauty of accepting that some things in this world were meant to remain unexplained. As the first ray of sunlight breached the horizon, Aurora began to change. Its form expanded, contracted, shifted through dimensions Emily's eyes couldn't quite process. The air itself seemed to bend and flex around it, reality rippling like water disturbed by a stone. In the last moment before it transcended physical form entirely, Emily caught a glimpse of what Aurora truly was. Something ancient and beautiful, a being of pure light and possibility that had chosen, for a brief time, to wear the shape of a puppy and share its wonder with her. Then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a sense of profound awe and a shimmer in the air that gradually faded like the last notes of a beautiful song. When Dr. Chen and his team arrived later that morning, they found only an ordinary veterinary clinic and a veterinarian who spoke of a strange puppy that had already moved on, leaving behind no evidence of its passing. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the forest holds its secrets close, Emily catches glimpses of impossible colors moving through the trees. And in those moments, she smiles, knowing that some discoveries are meant not to be explained, but simply to remind us that the world is far more wonderful and mysterious than we could ever imagine. The summer heat pressed against the windows of Evergreen Animal Hospital like a living thing, making the air shimmer and dance above the asphalt parking lot. 6 months had passed since Aurora's transcendent departure, but its impact lingered in ways Emily Parker never expected. The clinic itself had changed, though visitors rarely noticed the subtle differences. Shadows moved just a fraction too. Slowly, light bent at impossible angles in certain corners, and sometimes in the deepest part of night. Rooms seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was watching. Emily sat at her desk, reviewing patient files while trying to ignore the strange patterns that occasionally rippled across her computer screen. The morning had started normally enough. Routine checkups, vaccinations, the usual parade of cats and dogs that made up a small-town veterinary practice. But there was an electricity in the air, a familiar tension that made her skin prickle with anticipation. A soft chime from her phone interrupted her thoughts. The local wildlife rescue center was reporting unusual animal behavior throughout the region. Deer moving in perfect geometric patterns through forest clearings, birds flying in formations that defied aerodynamics. Even the fish in Cedar Creek had begun swimming in spirals that created impossible eddies in the water. Emily's heart quickened as she read the reports, recognizing the telltale signs of something she'd witnessed before. The bell above the clinic door jingled, and Emily looked up to find Sarah Collins, the diner owner, standing in her waiting room. Her usually cheerful face was drawn with worry. "Dr. Parker," she said, wringing her hands, "something's wrong with Max." She gestured to her golden retriever, who sat unnaturally still beside her, his eyes fixed on a point in space that seemed to shift and waver the longer Emily looked at it. As Emily led them into the examination room, she noticed Max's unusual behavior intensify. The dog's movements had become precise, almost mechanical, reminding her of how Aurora had moved in its final days. When she tried to examine him, her instruments gave impossible readings. His body temperature fluctuated wildly, his heartbeat seemed to echo from multiple locations simultaneously, and the digital thermometer simply displayed an endless stream of cycling numbers. "He started acting strange last night," Sarah explained, her voice tight with concern. "I found him sitting in the backyard, staring at the forest. He hasn't eaten, hasn't slept, and the sounds he's making—" She trailed off, shuddering slightly. "They're not dog sounds, Dr. Parker. They're something else entirely." As if on cue, Max lifted his head and emitted a sound that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't a bark or a whine, but a complex series of tones that seemed to phase in and out of human hearing range. The fluorescent lights flickered in response, and for a moment, Emily could have sworn she saw patterns moving beneath the dog's fur, like constellation maps shifting under his skin. The examination room door swung open, though Emily hadn't heard. Footsteps approaching. Mark Thompson stood in the doorway, his ranger's uniform dusty from the trails. His weathered face was grave as he surveyed the scene before him. "It's starting again," he said simply, his eyes meeting Emily's with understanding. "But this time it's different. This time it's everywhere." Sarah looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "What's starting? What's happening to my dog?" Emily hesitated, searching for words to explain something she barely understood herself. How could she describe the way reality seemed to be unraveling at the edges, how the natural world was beginning to move to rhythms that defied human comprehension? Mark saved her from having to answer. "Your dog's not sick, Sarah. He's awakening, like all of them are." He moved to the window, pointing toward the forest that bordered the clinic's property. In the distance, a deer stood motionless at the tree line, its form seeming to blur and sharpen with each breath. The barriers are thinning again, just like they did when the doctor's special patient was here. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, despite the summer heat. She hadn't told anyone the full truth about Aurora, but somehow Mark always seemed to know more than he let on. The old ranger had spent decades in these woods, witnessing things that defied explanation, keeping secrets that the modern world wasn't ready to understand. As they watched, Max rose from his sitting position with a fluid grace that no dog should possess. His movements had become impossibly smooth, as if he were moving through water rather than air. The patterns beneath his fur had become more pronounced, creating shifting designs that reminded Emily of the way Aurora's coat had looked in its final days. "We need to talk," Mark said quietly, leading Emily away from Sarah, who was watching her transformed pet with a mixture of fear and wonder. "There are others. Not just pets, wild animals, birds, even insects. They're all changing, all moving to some rhythm we can't hear. And it's spreading." In Mark's truck, bouncing along the Forest Service roads, Emily listened as the ranger shared what he'd observed. The changes had started subtly, animals moving with unexpected coordination, displaying behaviors that seemed almost choreographed. Then came the physical transformations. Fur that shimmered with impossible colors, eyes that held depths of awareness that shouldn't exist in non-human minds. They stopped at a clearing, deep in the forest. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns on the ground that seemed to move independently of the swaying branches above. A group of deer stood in a perfect circle at the center of the clearing, their forms flickering like bad television reception. As Emily watched, their antlers began to glow with an inner light that reminded her painfully of Aurora. "It's like they're being called," Mark mused, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like something is waking up in them, something that's always been there, just waiting for the right moment." He turned to Emily, his expression serious. "Your Aurora wasn't just a visitor, was it? It was a harbinger." Before Emily could respond, a sound cut through the forest. The same complex, multi-toned call they'd heard from Max, but amplified 1,000-fold. Every animal in the clearing went still, their forms beginning to shimmer and shift like heat waves above hot pavement. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost gelatinous with potential energy. The drive back to the clinic was silent, both Emily and Mark lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid, to be natural. As they pulled into the parking lot, Emily noticed Sarah's car was still there, though hours had passed since they'd left. Inside, they found Sarah sitting on the floor of the examination room, tears streaming down her face as she watched Max move through the air as if gravity had become optional. "He showed me things," Sarah whispered as they entered. "Images in my head, memories that aren't mine, knowledge that humans aren't supposed to have." She looked up at Emily with eyes that held a new awareness, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" That night, after Sarah had finally gone home with her transformed pet, Emily sat in her office trying to make sense of everything she'd witnessed. Her computer screen flickered with unsent emails to colleagues, attempting to describe what was happening in scientific terms. Each draft felt inadequate, unable to capture the profound strangeness of what was unfolding in Cedar Grove. The phone lines had been busy all evening as more pet owners called with similar stories. Dogs that could walk through walls, cats that appeared in multiple places simultaneously, parakeets whose songs could make plants grow and wilt in minutes. Each case added another piece to a puzzle whose final image remained frustratingly unclear. Near midnight, as Emily was preparing to finally head home, a new sound filled the air, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls of the clinic vibrated in response, and every surface began to shimmer, with that now familiar iridescence she'd first seen in Aurora's fur. Mark burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "You need to see this," he gasped, grabbing her arm and pulling her outside. The night sky above Cedar Grove had come alive with impossible colors, swirling and shifting like Aurora's coat had in its final moments. But it wasn't just the sky. The very air seemed to be transforming, becoming thick with possibilities. All around them, animals were emerging from homes and forests. Dogs led their confused owners on leashes, cats perched on shoulders like luminous guardians, and wild creatures moved through the streets with purpose. Each animal's form had begun to shift and change, taking on characteristics that bridged the gap between physical and ethereal. "They're not just changing," Emily realized, watching as a neighbor's tabby cat phased through a solid wall, trailing starlight in its wake. "They're evolving. Aurora wasn't unique. It was just the first to show us what was possible." As if in response to her words, the animals began to move in unison, creating patterns that made Emily's eyes water when she tried to follow them. The air grew thick with that strange, multi-toned singing, and reality itself seemed to flex and bend around them. In that moment, Emily understood that she was witnessing something beyond transformation. She was seeing the emergence of something that had always existed beneath the surface of the natural world, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The very fabric of Cedar Grove began to change as the night deepened. Streets shifted and flowed like liquid. Buildings seemed to breathe, and the boundaries between what was real and what was possible grew increasingly fluid. Through it all, the animals moved with purpose and grace, their forms becoming more light than matter, more energy than flesh. Standing in the midst of this transformation, Emily felt a familiar presence, not Aurora itself, but something that carried echoes of its essence. The air around her shimmered with potential, and for a brief moment she caught glimpses of what the animals were becoming, beings of pure light and consciousness, bridging the gap between worlds she hadn't known existed. Mark's hand found her shoulder, steadying her as reality continued to reshape itself around them. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder and uncertainty. Emily watched as Max trotted past, his form now more constellation than dog, leading Sarah toward whatever lay ahead. "We watch," Emily replied, understanding flowing through her like a current. "We learn, and we accept that everything we thought we knew about the natural world was just the beginning." Above them, the sky continued to shift and change, painting the world in colors that had no names, while all around them, the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary, one animal at a time. Dawn broke over Cedar Grove in waves of impossible color, painting the sky in shades that had no names in any human language. Dr. Emily Parker stood on the steps of Evergreen Animal Hospital, watching as the morning light caught and refracted off surfaces that shouldn't have been reflective. The transformation that had begun with her mysterious patient months ago had spread throughout the town like ripples in a cosmic pond, changing everything it touched in subtle but profound ways. The clinic's waiting room had become a gathering place for those seeking answers. Today, Jennifer Martinez sat nervously on the edge of her chair, clutching the carrier that contained what used to be her domestic short-hair cat, Perseus. Through the mesh door, Emily could see the feline's form shifting and rippling, its fur now a tapestry of moving constellations. Perseus's eyes, once a simple green, now held depths that seemed to spiral inward forever. "He started speaking to me last night," Jennifer whispered, her voice trembling. "Not in words exactly, but in images and feelings that appeared directly in my mind. He showed me things, other worlds, other possibilities, places where the laws of physics are more like suggestions." She paused, running a shaking hand through her hair. "Am I going crazy, Dr. Parker?" Emily knelt beside the carrier, meeting Perseus's infinite gaze. The cat acknowledged her with a slight tilt of its head, and suddenly her mind filled with cascading visions, geometric patterns that existed in more dimensions than she could comprehend, colors that sang, sounds that left visible traces in the air. She pulled back, steadying herself against the wall as the images faded. "You're not crazy," Emily assured Jennifer, though she wondered if perhaps the whole world was. "Perseus is evolving, like the others." She didn't mention how each transformed animal seemed to be developing unique abilities, ways of bending reality that defied categorization. Some, like Perseus, could share visions. Others could manipulate time and space in ways that made Einstein's theories seem like children's drawings. The sound of boots on hardwood announced Mark Thompson's arrival. The old ranger's uniform had begun to take on some of the strange properties of the animals he monitored. Colors that shifted with his movements, textures that seemed to exist just slightly out of phase with normal matter. He nodded to Jennifer before turning to Emily. "We've got a situation at the lake," he said quietly. "The fish. They're doing something new." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many impossible things to be surprised anymore, but this clearly had him worried. The drive to Cedar Lake took longer than it should have, the roads seeming to stretch and contract with each passing mile. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Mark's truck, watching as trees blurred past in patterns that suggested they were traveling through more than just physical space. When they finally arrived, the lake's surface looked wrong, not frozen, but somehow solid, as if the water had forgotten its natural state. A crowd had gathered at the shoreline, their faces illuminated by the strange light emanating from beneath the lake's surface. Dr. David Chen was there, his state wildlife authority, badge now seeming absurdly inadequate for the phenomena he was trying to document. His scientific instruments lay scattered around him, each displaying readings that defied analysis. "It started at sunrise," Chen explained as Emily and Mark approached. "The fish began swimming in formation, creating patterns that affected the water's molecular structure. They're not just moving through the lake anymore, they're redesigning it." His voice held a mixture of academic fascination and pure awe. Emily stepped closer to the water's edge, feeling the vibrations coming up through the ground. The lake's surface had taken on a crystalline quality, but instead of ice, it seemed to be composed of pure mathematics, geometric patterns that moved and flowed like liquid theorems. Beneath this transformed surface, thousands of fish moved in perfect synchronization, their scales now resembling fragments of stained glass that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. A soft meow made Emily turn. Perseus had somehow escaped his carrier and followed them, his transformed form moving with liquid grace across the crystallized lake surface. As he walked, each step left ripples of probability in his wake, small distortions in reality that spread outward like waves. Jennifer hurried after him, but stopped short at the water's edge, afraid to step onto the transformed surface. "It's safe," Perseus projected into their minds, his thoughts carrying a clarity that made Emily gasp. "They're not changing the lake. They're revealing what it's always been, beneath the illusion of ordinary matter." The cat's mental voice felt like wind chimes in Emily's consciousness, each thought triggering cascades of associated images and concepts. Dr. Chen had gone very still, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence of his senses. "This violates every known law of physics," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "The energy readings alone should be impossible, let alone the molecular restructuring we're observing." "Perhaps," Mark replied, his weathered face thoughtful, "we're not seeing violations of natural law, but rather the emergence of deeper laws we never knew existed." He reached down to touch the crystallized lake surface, and ripples of possibility spread out from his fingers, creating interference patterns with the fish-generated geometries below. As the morning wore on, more people gathered at the lake, drawn by reports of the transformation. Each transformed pet that arrived seemed to add new layers of complexity to the patterns. Dogs whose forms now resembled auroras bounded across the crystalline surface, leaving trails of quantum probability in their wake. Cats whose bodies had become living fractals perched on transformed rocks, their purring creating visible resonances in the fabric of space-time. Emily found herself making notes, trying to document what she was witnessing, though words seemed hopelessly inadequate. How could she describe the way reality itself appeared to be unfolding like an infinite origami, revealing layers of existence that had always been present but never before perceived? How could she explain the way each transformed animal seemed to be both physical creature and living equation, their very existence rewriting the rules of what was possible? Sarah Collins arrived around noon, Max padding silently beside her. The golden retriever's form had continued to evolve, his fur now resembling a field of quantum possibilities, each hair simultaneously existing in multiple states. As he approached the lake, the patterns beneath the surface responded, shifting to accommodate his presence in ways that suggested deep underlying connections. "They're building something," Max projected, his thoughts carrying the same melodic complexity that Emily had first noticed in Aurora's presence, not with matter or energy as you understand them, but with the raw stuff of reality itself, a bridge, perhaps, or a door. The dog's transformed eyes fixed on the lake's center, where the geometric patterns had begun to spiral inward, creating what looked like a well of pure possibility. Dr. Chen had given up on his instruments and was now simply watching, his notebook filled with drawings that seemed to move on the page, sketches that tried to capture the impossible geometries unfolding before them. "This isn't just evolution," he said softly. "This is emergence, as if the universe itself is waking up and using these animals as its first attempts at consciousness." The air grew thick with potential as the day progressed, each breath feeling like it contained more than just oxygen, as if they were inhaling pure possibility with every lungful. The transformed animals had begun moving in increasingly complex patterns, their movements synchronized across species and space. Dogs, cats, birds, and fish, all participating in what looked like an elaborate dance of reality restructuring. Around mid-afternoon, something new began to happen. The geometric patterns on the lake's surface started to rise, forming three-dimensional structures that seemed to exist in more directions than space should allow. The transformed animals gathered around these emerging forms, their own bodies resonating with whatever was taking shape. "It's a language," Perseus projected suddenly, his mental voice filled with excitement. "Not of words or symbols, but of pure pattern. They're teaching us how to read the universe's own alphabet." The cat's form had become almost entirely abstract, a living collection of mathematical principles, given just enough physical form to interact with conventional reality. Emily felt a familiar presence brush against her consciousness. Not Aurora itself, but something that carried echoes of its essence. The air around the lake had begun to shimmer with the same quality she'd first noticed in her mysterious patients. Fur, that suggestion of other realities just beneath the surface of the visible world. As sunset approached, the transformation reached a new level of intensity. The patterns on the lake's surface had become so complex that looking at them directly caused visual distortions, as if the human brain couldn't quite process what it was seeing. The transformed animals had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the central well of possibility, their forms now more energy than matter. Mark touched Emily's arm, pointing to the sky. The clouds above Cedar Lake had begun moving, in the same patterns as the fish below, creating a mirror image that spanned from water to heavens. Between these two layers of complexity, reality itself seemed to be folding and unfolding like some cosmic flower. "They're not just changing themselves," Emily realized, watching as the patterns began to affect the very air around them. "They're changing the way change itself works, rewriting the rules of transformation." The implications made her head spin. If this continued, what would it mean for the fundamental nature of reality itself? Dr. Chen had finally abandoned any pretense of scientific documentation and was simply standing at the water's edge, his face illuminated by the impossible light show above and below. "In all my years of studying wildlife," he murmured, "I never imagined, never dreamed." He trailed off, words failing in the face of what they were witnessing. The transformed animals continued their complex dance of reality manipulation, each movement adding new layers to the emerging patterns. Emily felt as if she were watching the universe learn to speak a new language, using these evolved creatures as its first attempts at vocabulary. Around her, the boundaries between what was real and what was possible grew increasingly fluid, suggesting that perhaps those boundaries had always been more permeable than humans had imagined. As night fell over Cedar Lake, the transformation showed no signs of slowing. If anything, the darkness only made the patterns more visible, more profound. The stars above seemed to pulse in rhythm with the geometric forms below, creating a sense of cosmic synchronicity that left everyone speechless. Emily stood watching, understanding that she was witnessing not just the evolution of Earth's creatures, but perhaps the next step in the evolution of reality itself. Midnight cast strange shadows through the windows of Evergreen Animal Hospital as Dr. Emily Parker reviewed security footage from the clinic's cameras. The recordings showed more than just the usual nighttime activities. They captured moments when reality itself seemed to hiccup, frames where the laws of physics took unexpected coffee breaks. In one sequence, a client's Yorkshire Terrier appeared to walk through 3 different dimensions simultaneously, its tiny form splitting and reconverging like light through a prism. The latest transformation had occurred just hours ago. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning Siamese cat, Jasper, had begun radiating soft pulses of energy that caused nearby electronics to display images from possible futures. The cat now sat in one of the examination rooms, its form oscillating between states of matter that shouldn't exist outside of theoretical physics textbooks. Every few minutes, Jasper would phase through the wall to check on his elderly owner, who had refused to leave, despite Emily's assurances that she would monitor him through the night. A gentle tapping at the window drew Emily's attention. Outside, fireflies danced in complex mathematical sequences, their lights tracing equations in the air that seemed to solve themselves. Even insects weren't immune to the wave of change sweeping through Cedar Grove. The natural world was being rewritten one species at a time, and Emily found herself at the center of it all, documenting transformations that defied scientific explanation. The quiet hum of her computer was interrupted by a sudden surge of static. On her screen, lines of code began appearing spontaneously, not in any programming language she recognized, but in patterns that reminded her of the geometric designs the transformed animals created. As she watched, the text began to arrange itself into spiraling fractals that extended beyond the boundaries of her monitor, projecting into the air like a hologram. Mark Thompson's truck pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the unusually thick night air. The old ranger wasn't alone. Dr. Rachel Martinez from the university's physics department sat in the passenger seat, her arms full of equipment that Emily had never seen before. The scientist had arrived in Cedar Grove 2 days ago, drawn by reports of astronomical anomalies centered around the town. "The readings are off the charts," Rachel announced as she burst through the door, her dark hair wild from the wind. She thrust a tablet toward Emily, its screen displaying wave patterns that pulsed and shifted in real time. "The quantum fluctuations around your clinic are creating ripples in the fabric of space-time itself. It's as if reality is being continuously rewritten at the subatomic level." Mark set down a heavy case of monitoring equipment, his expression grave. "The Forest Service is getting reports from other towns now, similar transformations spreading outward from Cedar Grove like a wave." He pulled out a map marked with glowing dots, each representing a confirmed case of animal transformation. The pattern they formed looked unsettlingly like the geometric designs Emily had first noticed in Aurora's fur. A soft chime from the examination room interrupted their discussion. Jasper had fully phased through the wall again, but this time, something was different. The cat's form had become almost entirely transparent, its body composed of shifting mathematical equations that seemed to describe the fundamental nature of existence. Mrs. Henderson gasped as her pet began to emit a gentle humming sound that made the air vibrate with possibility. "He's trying to communicate," Emily realized, recognizing the familiar sensation of thoughts being projected directly into her consciousness. The images that filled her mind were complex and multi-layered. She saw vast networks of energy connecting all living things, patterns of probability that shaped the flow of time itself, and glimpses of realities that existed parallel to our. Rachel's instruments went haywire as Jasper's transformation intensified. The cat's physical form had become a window into something vast and incomprehensible, a living equation that described not just its own existence, but the underlying mathematics of reality itself. Through this window, Emily caught glimpses of other dimensions, spaces where the laws of physics worked differently, where thought and matter were interchangeable. "The transformations aren't random," Rachel muttered, her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before her. "They're following some kind of pattern, some deep logic we're only beginning to understand." She adjusted her instruments, trying to capture readings that her equipment wasn't designed to measure. It's as if the animals are becoming living, embodiments of universal constants we never knew existed. The night deepened, and with it came new changes. The clinic's walls began to pulse with soft light, responding to the energy emanating from Jasper and the other transformed animals. In the recovery ward, every surface seemed to hold depths that shouldn't have been possible, as if ordinary matter was revealing its extraordinary nature. Mrs. Henderson had fallen asleep in her chair, her dreams visible as soft auroras that danced around her head. Jasper kept watch over her, its transformed form now resembling a constellation that had decided to take feline shape. The bond between pet and owner had evolved into something beyond normal understanding, a connection that transcended physical reality. Emily's phone buzzed with messages from other veterinarians across the country, each reporting similar transformations. In Seattle, a group of parakeets had begun singing in frequencies that altered the weather. In Boston, a retired racing greyhound had started leaving footprints that contained detailed maps of alternate timelines. The change that had begun with Aurora was spreading, becoming a global phenomenon that no one could explain or contain. Mark's radio crackled to life, carrying reports from Forest Service stations in the surrounding wilderness. Wild animals were gathering in patterns that could only be seen from satellite imagery, vast, living mandalas that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the Earth's magnetic field. Deer, wolves, bears, and smaller creatures moved in perfect synchronization, their forms becoming increasingly fluid and ethereal. Rachel's tablet displayed a live feed from the university's quantum physics lab, where researchers were detecting unprecedented fluctuations in the basic constants of nature. "The boundaries between possible and impossible are becoming permeable," she explained, her voice filled with academic excitement. "It's as if the animals are teaching us that our understanding of reality has been too limited, too rigid." A soft scratching at the clinic's back door revealed a raccoon, its form now composed of shifting fractal patterns that extended into dimensions the human eye wasn't meant to perceive. The creature had brought something, a small object that seemed to flicker in and out of existence as Emily approached. When she finally managed to focus on it, she realized it was a key, similar to the one Aurora had once left as a gift, but this one seemed to be made of pure possibility. The key floated gently in the air between them, rotating slowly to reveal symbols that changed with each turn. Emily felt drawn to it, understanding instinctively that it was more than just a physical object. It was an invitation, a tool for unlocking deeper mysteries that were only beginning to reveal themselves. Dr. Chen arrived shortly before dawn, his state wildlife authority credentials now seeming almost quaint in the face of what was unfolding. He had been tracking the transformations across the region, trying to establish patterns that might explain the inexplicable. His laptop contained hundreds of videos, each showing animals in various stages of transformation, evolving beyond their physical forms into something that existed between science and magic. "The military wants to quarantine the entire area," he announced grimly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They're talking about containing what they're calling a reality breach, But how do you contain something that's changing the very nature of containment itself? The frustration in his voice was evident. All his years of scientific training hadn't prepared him for a phenomenon that rewrote the rules of reality. As if in response to his words, the transformed animals in the clinic began to move in unison. Jasper phased through his examination room wall one final time, joining a growing congregation in the waiting room. The raccoon's fractal patterns synchronized with the quantum equations that now compose the Siamese cat's form. Even the fish in the waiting room aquarium had begun to shift, their scales becoming windows into other dimensions. The key that the raccoon had brought began to pulse with increasing intensity, its light creating patterns that matched the geometric designs Emily had first noticed in Aurora's fur. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential, as if reality was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Rachel's instruments recorded impossible data as the animals began what could only be described as a dance of transformation. Their movements created ripples in space-time that spread outward in perfect spirals, each wave carrying changes that affected the fundamental structure of reality. The clinic's walls became permeable, allowing glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities that existed alongside their own. They're not just changing themselves, Emily realized, watching as ordinary matter responded to the animals' influence. They're showing us what's possible when we let go of our limited understanding of what's real. The transformations had begun with Aurora, but they were becoming something far more profound, a revelation of the universe's true nature expressed through the evolved consciousness of Earth's creatures. Mark stood by the window, his ranger's training providing no context for what he was witnessing. "In all my years in these woods," he murmured, "I never imagined something like this. It's like the whole world is waking up, becoming aware of itself, in a new way." His uniform had begun to take on some of the strange properties of the transformed animals, the fabric shifting between states of matter as reality continued to rewrite itself. The key suspended in the air began to turn on its own, each rotation accompanied by a sound that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequency of existence. The transformed animals gathered around it, their evolved forms creating a living mandala of pure possibility. Emily felt drawn toward the center of their circle, understanding that she was being invited to witness something extraordinary. As the first light of dawn began to paint the horizon, the key's rotation reached a fever pitch. Reality itself seemed to bend around it, creating a doorway that existed in more dimensions than the human mind could comprehend. Through this opening, Emily caught glimpses of what Aurora had tried to show her, a universe far more vast and wonderful than anyone had imagined, where the boundaries between thought and matter, between possibility and reality, were merely suggestions rather than laws. The transformed animals moved as one, their forms merging into pure energy that flowed through the doorway like light through a prism. Each passage left traces in the air, writing new equations into the fabric of reality itself. Emily stood at the threshold of understanding, watching as the ordinary world revealed its extraordinary nature, one transformation at a time. Morning light spilled through the transformed windows of Evergreen Animal Hospital, each beam refracting into spectrums that shouldn't exist in normal space. Dr. Emily Parker pressed her palms against her desk, watching as ripples of probability spread outward from the point of contact. The wooden surface had begun responding to touch like water, though it maintained its solidity. One of the many impossibilities that had become routine in the past week. The local news played quietly on her computer monitor, though the broadcast kept shifting between multiple versions of itself, showing alternate timelines where the story had different outcomes. The anchor's voice remained steady as she reported on the growing phenomenon. Government officials remain silent on the widespread reports of unusual animal behavior across the Pacific Northwest. Citizens are advised to remain calm and report any unexpected transformations to their local authorities. A sharp knock at the clinic's door interrupted Emily's thoughts. Through the wavering glass, she could make out the stern figure of Colonel Michael Hayes, his military uniform a stark contrast to the fluid reality around him. The Pentagon had finally noticed what was happening in Cedar Grove, and their response was exactly what Emily had feared. "Dr. Parker," Hayes began as soon as she opened the door, his voice clipped and professional. "I represent a joint task force investigating the anomalies in this region. We need to discuss containment protocols." Behind him, a team of soldiers unloaded equipment from unmarked vehicles, their movements precise and practiced. Emily felt a familiar tension build in her chest. The military's presence complicated an already complex situation. Through the open door, she could see their vehicles parked in formation around the clinic, creating a perimeter that seemed both protective and threatening. The transformed animals in her care reacted immediately to the new presence, their forms becoming more fluid, less bound by physical constraints. In the recovery ward, a recently transformed husky named Shadow began emitting pulses of energy that made time flow differently in its vicinity. The soldiers' movements became desynchronized, some moving faster, while others seemed frozen in mid-step. Colonel Hayes frowned as his watch began displaying different times simultaneously. "Chida-ai," hands spinning in impossible patterns. "As you can see," Emily gestured to the chaos unfolding around them. "Conventional containment isn't going to work here. The transformations don't follow any rules we understand." She led Hayes through the clinic, showing him how ordinary objects had begun taking on extraordinary properties. File cabinets that opened into spaces larger than the room itself, examination tables that occasionally phased out of normal space-time, and windows that showed views of places that couldn't possibly exist. Dr. Rachel Martinez arrived during the demonstration, her arms full of new monitoring equipment. The physicist had been working around the clock, trying to document the increasingly bizarre phenomena. "The quantum readings are off the charts," she announced, ignoring the military presence. "The transformation effect is accelerating, spreading faster than we can track it. Look at this." She held up a tablet, displaying a map of the region. Dots of light showed the spread of transformations, but the pattern had changed. Instead of moving outward in a simple wave, the effects were now jumping between locations instantaneously, creating geometric patterns that seemed to fold through higher dimensions. Colonel Hayes studied the map with growing concern. "This is precisely why we need to establish control protocols. If these transformations continue to spread..." He was cut off by a sudden shift in the clinic's interior space. The walls rippled, like curtains in a breeze, and for a moment, everyone could see through them into what appeared to be multiple versions of reality layered on top of each other. Mark Thompson burst through the door, his ranger uniform now permanently altered by proximity to the transformed animals. "We've got a situation in the National Forest," he announced, barely acknowledging the military personnel. "The wildlife is organizing. Not just individual animals anymore, entire species moving together, creating patterns we can only see from satellite imagery." The colonel's radio crackled to life, multiple voices reporting similar phenomena across the country. In Yellowstone, wolves had begun moving in formations that altered the local magnetic field. The Everglades were experiencing temporal anomalies centered around transformed alligators. Even the oceans were showing signs of change, with reports of whale songs that could bend light. Emily felt overwhelmed by the escalating situation. What had started with one mysterious puppy had become a global phenomenon that threatened to rewrite the rules of reality itself. The military's presence added a new layer of tension. She could see the fear behind Colonel Hayes's professional demeanor. the deep unease of someone trained to fight tangible enemies, now faced with something that defied comprehension. A commotion from the waiting room drew their attention. Mrs. Henderson's Siamese cat, Jasper, had begun projecting images into the air. Not just memories or possible futures, but what appeared to be messages. Complex mathematical equations floated in glowing strands, interweaving with geometric patterns that seemed to describe the structure of reality itself. Dr. Martinez rushed to document the display, her instruments struggling to measure phenomena they weren't designed to detect. "These equations," she muttered, eyes wide with academic excitement, "they're not just describing the transformations. They're showing us how reality itself works. It's like the animals are trying to teach us something." Colonel Hayes watched the floating equations with growing alarm. This is exactly what we're concerned about. These creatures are developing abilities we can't control or predict. They're changing the fundamental nature of our world without any oversight or understanding of the consequences. As if in response to his words, Shadow the husky stepped through what appeared to be a fold in space, emerging with something clutched gently in its mouth. The object looked like a small crystal, but its geometry seemed wrong, as if it extended into dimensions that human eyes couldn't process. When the dog set it down, it began to hover above the floor, rotating slowly and emitting pulses of light that made everyone's thoughts feel simultaneously clearer and stranger. Emily approached the crystal carefully, feeling the same sense of recognition she'd experienced when she first found Aurora. The object resonated with a familiar frequency, reminding her of the way her mysterious patient's fur had shimmered with otherworldly light. As she reached for it, the crystal responded to her proximity, its light intensifying and creating patterns in the air that looked like blueprints for reality itself. "Don't touch it," Colonel Hayes ordered, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Emily's fingers made contact with the crystal's surface, and suddenly her consciousness expanded. She saw the world as the transformed animals saw it. A fluid, interconnected web of possibilities where the boundaries between matter and energy, between thought and reality, were merely suggestions rather than laws. The vision lasted only moments, but when it faded, Emily understood something fundamental had changed. The crystal had shown her what Aurora had been trying to tell her all along. The transformations weren't a crisis to be contained, but an evolution to be understood. The animals weren't breaking reality, they were revealing its true nature. Dr. Martinez's instruments recorded impossible data as the crystal's influence spread through the clinic. Every transformed animal began to resonate with its energy, their forms becoming even more fluid and extraordinary. The military equipment shut down, unable to process what it was detecting. Even the soldiers seemed affected, their movements becoming uncertain as reality shifted around them. "This isn't something you can fight," Emily told Colonel Hayes, watching as the crystal's light created patterns that matched the geometric designs in Aurora's fur. "These transformations are showing us that the world is far more complex and wonderful than we imagined. The animals aren't changing into something new, they're revealing what they've always been beneath the surface of what we thought was possible." The colonel's response was cut off by a sudden change in the atmosphere. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential, and through the clinic's windows, they could see more animals approaching. Dogs led their confused owners, cats appeared and disappeared like quantum particles, and birds flew in formations that left traces of probability in the sky. Each transformed creature carried something, small objects that resonated with the same energy as the crystal shadow had brought. As they gathered around the clinic, their combined presence began to affect the fabric of reality itself. The boundaries between possible and impossible grew increasingly fluid, and Emily could feel the world shifting towards something new and extraordinary. Mark Thompson watched the gathering with understanding in his weathered face. "They're not just bringing messages," he said softly. "They're bringing keys to unlock the next stage of evolution." His words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades watching the forest's mysteries unfold. The crystal floating in the center of the clinic began to pulse in rhythm with the objects the other animals had brought. Each pulse sent waves of transformation through reality, revealing layers of existence that had always been present but never before perceived. The military personnel stood frozen, their training useless against a phenomenon that challenged the very nature of what they thought they were protecting. As the pulses intensified, Emily felt a familiar presence brush against her consciousness. Not Aurora itself, but something that carried echoes of its essence. The air filled with patterns of light that matched the geometric designs she'd first noticed in her mysterious patient's fur. And she understood that they were approaching another threshold of change. The transformed animals moved in perfect synchronization, their forms becoming more light than matter, more possibility than physical reality. Through the crystal's influence, they were showing everyone present a glimpse of what the world could become, a place where the extraordinary wasn't just possible but natural. Sunset painted Cedar Grove in impossible colors as military vehicles rolled through the streets, their metal surfaces reflecting light in ways that defied physics. Dr. Emily Parker watched from the roof of Evergreen Animal Hospital as soldiers established checkpoints at every major intersection. The government's attempt to contain the spreading transformations felt futile, like trying to hold back the tide with a paper cup. Colonel Hayes had established his command center in the town hall, filling the historic building with advanced monitoring equipment and grim-faced personnel in hazmat suits. Their instruments beeped and whirred continuously, recording data they couldn't understand, about phenomena they couldn't explain. The colonel's initial skepticism had given way to a kind of desperate determination to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. A gentle nudge against Emily's leg drew her attention downward. Shadow, the transformed husky, stood beside her on the roof, though "stood" wasn't quite the right word anymore. The dog's paws didn't quite touch the surface, and its form seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Through its fur, Emily could see patterns that matched the constellation maps Dr. Martinez had been studying, as if the dog's body had become a window into the cosmic dance of stars. "They're afraid," Shadow projected into Emily's mind, its thoughts carrying images of the soldiers below, their auras tight with tension and fear. The ability of transformed animals to communicate directly through consciousness had become more refined, more precise. They could now share not just images and emotions, but entire concepts that unfolded in the recipient's mind like blooming flowers. Movement in the street caught Emily's attention. A military convoy was escorting Dr. David Chen toward the clinic, his official Wildlife Authority vehicle now modified with equipment that made it look more like a rolling laboratory. Chen had been working with the government task force, trying to bridge the gap between scientific understanding and the impossible reality they faced. The convoy stopped short as Jasper materialized in the middle of the road, the Siamese cats, transformed form-casting shadows that moved independently of light sources. The soldiers raised their weapons, modified with what they claimed were reality stabilization fields, but the cats simply phased through their vehicles, leaving traces of quantum probability in its wake. Emily hurried down to meet Chen, knowing the situation could escalate quickly if the military felt threatened. She found him in the clinic's waiting room, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from long hours of research. The walls around them pulsed gently with residual energy from the transformed animals, making the space feel alive and aware. "They're implementing new protocols," Chen announced without preamble, spreading documents across the reception desk. Full quarantine of any animal showing signs of transformation. Mandatory reporting of unusual phenomena. They're even talking about evacuating the town. His voice carried equal measures of scientific fascination and moral concern. A series of loud beeps from Chen's equipment interrupted their conversation. The devices were detecting massive energy fluctuations throughout the clinic, readings that made the sensors spark and smoke. Through the windows, they could see more transformed animals gathering in the parking lot, each one carrying objects that resonated with impossible energy. Dr. Rachel Martinez burst through the door, her lab coat covered in equations that wrote and rewrote themselves across the fabric. "The quantum field measurements are off the scale," she exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement despite her obvious exhaustion. "The transformations aren't just spreading anymore. They're accelerating, becoming more complex. Look at this." She held up her tablet, displaying a three-dimensional model of the energy patterns flowing through Cedar Grove. The town had become a nexus of transformation, with waves of change rippling outward in geometric patterns that folded through higher dimensions. At the center of it all was Evergreen Animal Hospital, pulsing like a heart-pumping pure possibility into the world. Mark Thompson arrived as night fell, his ranger uniform now permanently altered by prolonged exposure to the transformed wildlife. "The Forest Service has lost control of the situation," he reported grimly. "The animals are moving in ways we can't track or predict. Traditional boundaries don't mean anything anymore. Bears are walking through solid rock. Deer are appearing in multiple places at once. And the birds." He trailed off, gesturing to the sky, where flocks moved in formations that bent light itself. A commotion outside drew their attention. Colonel Hayes had arrived with a team of specialists, their vehicles equipped with devices designed to dampen the transformation effect. As they approached the clinic, the transformed animals reacted. Shadow's form became even more fluid, its edges bleeding into probability waves. Jasper phased completely out of normal space-time, becoming visible only as patterns of pure mathematics, floating in the air. The crystal that Shadow had brought earlier began to pulse with increasing intensity, its light creating interference patterns with the military's dampening fields. Reality around the clinic became unstable, shifting between multiple possible states like a quantum particle refusing to collapse into a single form. Emily felt a familiar sensation. The same expansion of consciousness she'd experienced when she first touched the crystal. Through this enhanced awareness, she could see what the military's instruments couldn't. The transformations weren't random mutations or external changes, but the emergence of something that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary reality. "You can't stop this with technology," she told Colonel Hayes as he approached, his dampening devices creating visible distortions in the air. "The animals aren't breaking reality. They're showing us its true nature. Every attempt to contain them only reveals more of what they're trying to teach us." The Colonel's response was cut short by a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The transformed animals had begun moving in synchronized patterns, their forms becoming increasingly abstract. Each movement left traces in the air like mathematical equations written in light, describing principles of reality that human science had barely begun to grasp. Dr. Martinez's instruments recorded impossible data as the animals' dance intensified. The energy readings suggested that space and time themselves were being rewritten, reorganized into patterns that better reflected the true nature of existence. The military's dampening fields flickered and failed, unable to process phenomena that operated outside the known laws of physics. Chen watched in amazement as his wildlife documents began to change, the text rearranging itself to describe species that existed in multiple states simultaneously. "We need to rethink everything we thought we knew about biology," he muttered, scribbling notes that seemed to write themselves in fractal patterns across his notebook. The transformed animals gathered closer, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that made reality itself malleable. Through their enhanced consciousness, they projected images and concepts that expanded human understanding, showing glimpses of a universe far more complex and interconnected than anyone had imagined. Colonel Hayes stood at the edge of this transformation, his military training providing no context for what he was witnessing. The soldiers behind him shifted nervously as their equipment continued to malfunction, displaying readings that shouldn't have been possible. Some of their weapons had begun to transform as well, metal and plastic flowing into shapes that suggested alternate forms of existence. Emily felt the familiar presence of Aurora's essence, not the creature itself, but the change it had initiated. The air filled with patterns that matched those first mysterious markings, geometric designs that described the underlying structure of reality. Through these patterns, she could see the next stage of transformation approaching, not just for the animals, but for everything. Mark Thompson moved to stand beside her, his transformed uniform now resembling a window into other dimensions. "This was always going to happen," he said softly, watching as reality continued to shift and flow around them. "The animals are just showing us what's been true all along, that the world is far more extraordinary than we allowed ourselves to believe." The crystal at the center of the clinic began to resonate with the objects the other animals had brought, creating harmonies that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. Each resonance revealed new layers of reality, showing how the transformations weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper principles that had always existed. Dr. Martinez worked frantically to document everything, though her instruments could barely process what they were detecting. "The energy patterns are becoming more organized," she reported, her voice filled with academic wonder. "It's as if the animals are creating a new language, not just for communication, but for restructuring reality itself." The military's containment efforts continued to fail as the transformation spread beyond their ability to measure or control. Their equipment, designed to maintain stable reality fields, instead began to reveal more of the fluid nature of existence. Each failure brought new insights, showing how their attempts to impose order were actually helping to reveal the true complexity of the world. Shadow moved through the chaos with fluid grace, its form now resembling a living constellation that walked between worlds. The Husky's thoughts reached out to everyone present, sharing visions of what was coming, not an ending, but an evolution, a shift in the very nature of being that would change everything they thought they knew about existence. The first light of dawn illuminated Cedar Grove's transformed skyline, where buildings now shifted between states of matter like waves on a quantum sea. Dr. Emily Parker stood in her clinic's examination room, watching military scientists install containment equipment around a recently transformed golden retriever. The dog's body had become a living prism, splitting reality into visible spectrums of possibility that the government's instruments struggled to measure. A sharp knock echoed through the clinic, and Dr. Elizabeth Warner from the CDC entered, her hazmat suit marked with symbols that seemed to move of their own accord. The government had escalated their response, bringing in experts from every field to study what they now classified as a reality-altering contagion. The transformation's spread had triggered international concern, leading to increased pressure for containment and control. "We need to begin the isolation protocols," Warner announced, her voice distorted by her protective gear. "The Pentagon is concerned about the rate of transformation. They're talking about declaring a national emergency." "Huko." She gestured to a team of technicians who began setting up quarantine barriers designed to stabilize local reality fields. Emily felt her heart sink as she watched them work. The barriers hummed with energy meant to dampen the transformation effect, but they seemed to only make it more pronounced. Each attempt at containment revealed new aspects of the change, as if reality itself was responding to their efforts by becoming more fluid, more extraordinary. Outside, Colonel Hayes directed operations from a mobile command center, his face illuminated by screens displaying impossible data. Military drones circled overhead, their cameras capturing footage that seemed to change every time it was reviewed, showing different versions of events playing out simultaneously. Mark Thompson arrived with urgent news from the Forest Service. "The wildlife is responding to the containment efforts," he reported, his uniform rippling with quantum interference patterns. "They're organizing in ways we've never seen before. The wolves are leading entire ecosystems through transformation, and the birds—" He paused, looking skyward, where flocks moved in formations that wrote mathematical theorems across the atmosphere. Dr. Rachel Martinez burst through the door, her laboratory equipment sparking with excess energy. "The quantum readings are becoming incoherent," she exclaimed, showing them data streams that flowed like liquid light across her screens. "The transformed animals aren't just changing randomly anymore. They're coordinating their effects, creating something larger than individual transformations." In the recovery ward, Jasper phased through the quarantine barriers as if they didn't exist. The Siamese cat's form now resembling a living equation that solved itself in real time. The military's reality stabilization fields bent around him, creating distortions that revealed layers of existence normally hidden from human perception. Dr. David Chen worked frantically at his makeshift laboratory station, analyzing samples that kept changing state under his microscope. "The cellular structure is evolving beyond three-dimensional space," he muttered, making notes that curved across his paper in Mobius strips of text. "It's as if their DNA has learned to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously." A commotion outside drew their attention. A group of transformed pets had gathered at the edge of the military perimeter, each one carrying objects that resonated with impossible energy. The items they brought seemed to exist in superposition, simultaneously being and not being, their very presence challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Colonel Hayes approached the gathering, his reality dampening equipment, creating visible distortions in the air. "We need to establish control," he insisted, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "These transformations are spreading too quickly, becoming too unpredictable. The potential risks to national security." His words were interrupted by a sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. The transformed animals had begun moving in synchronized patterns that seemed to fold space itself, creating geometric designs that matched the ones Emily had first noticed in Aurora's fur. Each movement revealed more of the underlying structure of reality, showing how the transformations weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper truths. Dr. Warner's containment team reported failures across their barrier network. As reality continued to rewrite itself around their equipment, the quarantine fields, designed to stabilize normal space-time, instead became windows into multiple layers of existence. Through these unintended portals, everyone could see how the world really worked, a fluid dance of probability and possibility rather than fixed rules and rigid boundaries. Shadow moved through the chaos with practiced ease. The transformed Husky's form, now resembling a living constellation that walked between worlds. Through enhanced consciousness, the dog shared visions of what was coming, not destruction or disorder, but a fundamental shift in the nature of being itself. Emily felt the familiar resonance of Aurora's influence, not the creature itself, but the change it had initiated. The air filled with patterns that described principles beyond human science, showing how the transformations were part of a larger process of universal evolution. Each new development revealed more of what her mysterious patient had tried to show her, that reality was far more flexible and extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The crystal at the center of the clinic pulsed with increasing intensity, its light creating interference patterns with the military's equipment. Reality around the building became increasingly fluid, shifting between states that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics. Dr. Martinez's instruments recorded data that suggested the very constants of nature were being rewritten. Through the windows, they could see more transformed animals approaching from all directions. Dogs led their confused owners, cats appeared and disappeared like quantum particles, and birds flew in formations that left traces of probability. In the sky, each creature carried something, objects that resonated with the same energy as the crystal, creating a network of transformation that spread across the town. Colonel Hayes watched helplessly as his containment strategies continued to fail. The military's advanced technology, designed to maintain stable reality fields, instead revealed more of the fluid nature of existence. Each failure brought new insights, showing how their attempts to impose order were actually helping to reveal the true complexity of the world. Dr. Warner removed her helmet, realizing the futility of protection against something that wasn't a contagion, but an evolution. Her CDC protocols, based on containing physical threats, had no relevance to a phenomenon that operated on the level of reality itself. The transformation wasn't spreading like a disease, it was awakening like consciousness. Mark Thompson understood this better than most, his years in the forest having taught him to recognize patterns that others missed. The animals aren't just changing themselves, he explained, watching as reality continued to shift and flow around them. They're showing us what's always been true, that the world is far more extraordinary than we allowed ourselves to believe. The transformed animals moved with increasing purpose, their forms becoming more abstract, more pure energy than matter. Each movement left traces in the air like mathematical equations written in light, describing principles of reality that human science had barely begun to grasp. Through their enhanced consciousness, they projected images and concepts that expanded human understanding, showing glimpses of a universe far more complex and interconnected than anyone had imagined. Dr. Martinez worked frantically to document everything, though her instruments could barely process what they were detecting. The energy patterns are becoming more organized, she reported, her voice filled with academic wonder. It's as if the animals are creating a new language, not just for communication, but for restructuring reality itself. Emily felt the weight of the moment as she watched the military's containment efforts crumble in the face of something far more powerful than their technology could handle. The transformation wasn't something that could be controlled or contained. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself, a change that had been set in motion the moment Aurora had first appeared at her clinic. The transformed animals gathered closer, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that made reality itself malleable. Through their enhanced consciousness, they shared visions of what was coming. Not an ending, but an evolution, a shift in the very nature of being that would change everything they thought they knew about existence. The crystal at the center of it all continued to pulse with impossible light, its energy resonating with the objects the other animals had brought. Each pulse revealed more of the underlying structure of reality, showing how the transformations weren't random mutations, but the emergence of something that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary existence. As the morning light grew stronger, Emily understood that they had reached a critical moment. The military's attempts at containment, the CDC's protocols, the scientific community's efforts to understand, all of these approaches were based on old assumptions about how reality worked. The transformed animals were showing them something new, something that required not control or analysis, but acceptance and adaptation. Shadow moved to her side, the husky's transformed form now existing in multiple states simultaneously. Through their shared consciousness, Emily could see what needed to happen next, not a fight against the transformation, but an embrace of what it revealed about the true nature of existence. Midnight cast strange shadows through the windows of Evergreen Animal Hospital as government vehicles surrounded the building. The air crackled with tension and possibility as Dr. Emily Parker faced Colonel Hayes across her desk, the space between them distorted by competing fields of transformed reality. Outside, military spotlights cut through the darkness, their beams bending in impossible ways as they encountered pockets of altered space-time. "The Joint Chiefs have made their decision," Hayes announced, his voice tight with barely contained stress. "They're implementing Protocol Omega at dawn. Total containment, no exceptions." He spread a map across the desk, though the paper kept shifting between states, the ink flowing like liquid as reality fluctuated around them. Red circles marked areas of highest transformation activity, with Cedar Grove pulsing at the center like a quantum heartbeat. Dr. Elizabeth Warner from the CDC stood by the window, watching as more transformed animals gathered at the perimeter. Her hazmat suit had begun to take on properties of the transformation, the material becoming semi-transparent and showing glimpses of other dimensions. "The containment field isn't holding," she reported, checking readings on equipment that sparked and sputtered with excess energy. "Every time we strengthen it, the transformations become more pronounced." Through the clinic's front windows, Emily could see military technicians setting up massive reality stabilization generators. The machines hummed with ominous energy, designed to lock down local space-time and prevent further transformation. But even as they powered up, the transformed animals responded in ways the military hadn't anticipated. Jasper, the Siamese cat, phased through multiple layers of reality simultaneously, his form splitting into quantum possibilities that the containment field couldn't process. Each movement left traces of mathematical equations in the air, describing principles of existence that human science was only beginning to grasp. The military's sensors overloaded, trying to track his path, sending cascades of sparks into the night. Dr. Rachel Martinez burst through the door, her laboratory coat now permanently altered by exposure to the transformation field. Numbers and symbols crawled across the fabric like living things, rearranging themselves into formulas that explained the impossible events unfolding around them. "The quantum readings are off the scale," she exclaimed, her tablet displaying data that seemed to move in 4 dimensions. "The animals aren't just resisting the containment, they're using it to amplify the transformation effect." Mark Thompson arrived with urgent reports from the forest's edge. The ranger's uniform had become a window into other realities, showing glimpses of worlds that existed alongside their own. "The wildlife is responding to the military presence," he explained, his voice carrying echoes of other possibilities. "The bears are walking through solid matter, deer are manipulating probability fields, and the birds." He gestured to the sky, where flocks moved in patterns that rewrote the laws of physics. Shadow, the transformed husky, stood at Emily's side, its form now resembling a living constellation that breathed and moved. Through their shared consciousness, the dog projected images of what Protocol Omega would really mean, not containment, but a violent collision between human attempts at control and the unstoppable tide of universal evolution. Dr. David Chen worked frantically at his monitoring station, trying to make sense of readings that challenged everything he thought he knew about biology. "The cellular structures are evolving beyond physical space," he muttered, watching through a microscope as samples shifted between states of matter. "It's as if their very DNA has learned to exist in quantum superposition." The crystal at the center of the clinic pulsed with increasing intensity, its light creating interference patterns with the military's containment field. Each pulse revealed more of reality's true nature, showing how the transformations weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper principles that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary existence. Colonel Hayes watched as his carefully planned containment strategy began to unravel. The reality stabilization generators, designed to dampen the transformation effect, instead created windows into multiple layers of existence. Through these unintended portals, everyone could see the fluid nature of reality that the transformed animals had been trying to reveal. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Emily tried to explain, gesturing to the impossible scenes unfolding around them. "These animals aren't breaking reality, they're showing us its true nature. Every attempt to contain them only reveals more of what they're trying to teach us." Dr. Warner removed her protective gear, realizing the futility of physical barriers against something that operated on the level of reality itself. "This isn't a contagion we can quarantine," she admitted, watching as reality continued to rewrite itself around their equipment. "It's more like an awakening." The transformed animals moved with increasing purpose, their forms becoming more energy than matter. Each movement left traces in the air like living mathematics, describing principles of existence that transcended human understanding. Through their enhanced consciousness, they projected visions of what was coming. Not destruction, but transformation on a scale that would change everything. Emily felt the familiar resonance of Aurora's influence, not the creature itself, but the change it had initiated. The air filled with patterns that matched those first mysterious markings, geometric designs that described the underlying structure of reality. Through these patterns, she could see the next stage of transformation approaching, not just for the animals, but for everything. Mark Thompson moved to stand beside her, his transformed uniform now resembling a gateway between dimensions. "This was always going to happen," he said softly, watching as reality continued to shift and flow around them. "The animals are just showing us what's been true all along, that the world is far more extraordinary than we allowed ourselves to believe." The crystal began to resonate with the objects other animals had brought, creating harmonies that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. Each resonance revealed new layers of reality, showing how the transformations weren't random mutations, but the emergence of something that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary existence. Dr. Martinez worked frantically to document everything, though her instruments could barely process what they were detecting. "The energy patterns are becoming more organized," she reported, her voice filled with academic wonder. "It's as if the animals are creating a new language, not just for communication, but for restructuring reality itself." Outside the military's containment efforts continued to fail as the transformation spread beyond their ability to measure or control. Their equipment, designed to maintain stable reality fields, instead began to reveal more of the fluid nature of existence. Each failure brought new insights, showing how their attempts to impose order were actually helping to reveal the true complexity of the world. Colonel Hayes received urgent communications from his superiors, their voices distorted by reality, fluctuations that made radio waves bend in impossible ways. The Pentagon was preparing to escalate their response, bringing in weapons designed to stabilize reality through brute force. But Emily could see the futility in their approach. Trying to force the universe back into a box it had never really fit in. The transformed animals gathered closer, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that made reality itself malleable. Through their enhanced consciousness, they shared visions of what was coming. Not an ending, but an evolution. A shift in the very nature of being that would change everything they thought they knew about existence. Shadow moved through the chaos with fluid grace, its form now resembling a living equation that solved itself in real time. The Husky's thoughts reached out to everyone present, sharing glimpses of a universe far more complex and interconnected than anyone had imagined. Through these visions, they could see how the transformations weren't destroying reality, but revealing its true nature. As dawn approached, Emily understood that they had reached a crucial moment. The military's containment protocols, the CDC's quarantine efforts, the scientific community's attempts to understand, all were based on old assumptions about how reality worked. The transformed animals were showing them something new, something that required not control or analysis, but acceptance and adaptation. The crystal pulsed with increasing urgency, its light creating patterns that matched the geometric designs in Aurora's fur. Through these patterns, Emily could see what needed to happen next. Not a fight against the transformation, but an embrace of what it revealed about the true nature of existence. The question wasn't how to stop what was happening, but how to help it unfold in a way that wouldn't tear reality apart at the seams. As the first light of dawn painted the horizon in impossible colors, Emily made her decision. She would have to find a way to show Colonel Hayes and the others that their attempts at containment weren't just futile, they were potentially dangerous. The transformation wasn't something that could be controlled or stopped. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself, and fighting against it would only make the transition more difficult and potentially catastrophic. Thunder rolled across Cedar Grove as military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through. Storm clouds that twisted into impossible shapes. Lightning flickered in colors that shouldn't exist, illuminating the chaos unfolding around Evergreen Animal Hospital. Dr. Emily Parker watched from her office window as reality itself seemed to tear at the seams, pushed to its breaking point by the collision between transformation and containment. The government's final solution had arrived, a massive device they called the reality anchor, its metallic surface covered in symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Teams of scientists in protective gear worked frantically to assemble it in the clinic's parking lot, their movements precise despite the waves of distorted space-time that rippled through the air. Once activated, it will create a field of absolute stability, Dr. Elizabeth Warner explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Nothing will be able to change or transform within its radius. The effect should spread until it covers the entire affected area. She didn't meet Emily's eyes as she spoke, her attention fixed on monitoring equipment that struggled to maintain coherent readings. Colonel Hayes directed operations from a reinforced command center, his face illuminated by screens showing impossible data. "We're detecting reality fractures throughout the region," he announced, pointing to a map where red lines spread like cracks in glass. "If we don't stabilize things now, the whole fabric of existence could unravel." Through the quantum interference, Emily could see transformed animals gathering at the edges of the military perimeter. Their forms had become increasingly abstract, more energy than matter, each one radiating patterns that matched the geometric designs she'd first noticed in Aurora's fur. They moved with purpose now, as if responding to some signal that human sensors couldn't detect. Dr. Rachel Martinez burst through the door, her laboratory equipment sparking with excess energy. "The quantum readings are becoming critical," she exclaimed, showing data streams that flowed like liquid light across her screens. The reality anchor. It's not just stabilizing space-time, it's trying to force everything back into a simpler state of existence. The consequences could be catastrophic. Mark Thompson arrived with urgent news, his ranger uniform now completely transformed into a living window between dimensions. "The forest is changing faster than ever," he reported, his words leaving traces of probability in the air. "The animals aren't just evolving anymore, they're transcending physical form entirely, and they're all moving towards something." Shadow, the transformed husky, materialized beside Emily, its body now resembling a constellation that had learned to walk. Through their shared consciousness, the dog projected visions of what the reality anchor would really do, not stabilize existence, but strip it of the complexity and wonder that made it real. The military's solution would reduce reality to a simple, rigid state that couldn't support the kind of life the universe was trying to become. Dr. David Chen worked desperately at his monitoring station, watching as reality fluctuations intensified around the reality anchor. "The energy patterns are all wrong," he muttered, making notes that curved through multiple dimensions. "We're not just dealing with physical transformation anymore. This is fundamental change at the level of existence itself." The crystal at the center of the clinic pulsed with increasing urgency, its light creating interference patterns that revealed the true nature of what was happening. Each pulse showed more of the universe's underlying structure, demonstrating how the transformations weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper principles that had always existed. Colonel Hayes received urgent communications from his superiors, as reality distortions made conventional technology increasingly unreliable. The Pentagon was preparing to activate the reality anchor despite growing evidence that it might cause more harm than good. Their fear of the unknown outweighed their understanding of what was really happening. Outside, the military's containment field buzzed with dangerous energy as it tried to hold back the tide of transformation. Each attempt to stabilize reality only seemed to make it more fluid, more prone to showing its true nature. The transformed animals moved through these distortions with practiced ease, their evolved consciousness allowing them to navigate the shifting layers of existence. Emily felt the familiar resonance of Aurora's influence growing stronger, not the creature itself, but the change it had initiated. The air filled with patterns that described principles beyond human science, showing how the transformations were part of a larger process of universal evolution. Each new development revealed more of what her mysterious patient had tried to show her, that reality was far more flexible and extraordinary than anyone had imagined. Jasper phased through multiple layers of probability, the Siamese cat's form now resembling a living equation that solved itself in real time. The military's reality stabilization fields bent around him, creating distortions that revealed layers of existence normally hidden from human perception. Through these glimpses, everyone could see the true complexity of the world they had tried so hard to simplify. As the reality anchor powered up, its energy field spreading like a wave of enforced normality, the transformed animals began to move with new purpose. They gathered in geometric patterns that matched the designs Emily had seen in Aurora's fur, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that pushed back against the military's attempt to lock down existence. Dr. Warner watched, in growing horror as her instruments showed the potential consequences of what they were about to do. The reality anchor isn't just affecting the transformations, she realized, her voice shaking. It's trying to rewrite the fundamental laws of existence. We could end up destroying the very thing we're trying to protect. The crystal's pulsing reached a fever pitch as reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Through the windows, Emily could see more transformed animals arriving. Dogs that walked through quantum probability clouds, cats that existed in multiple states simultaneously, birds that flew in patterns that rewrote the laws of physics. Each one carried something, objects that resonated with the same energy as the crystal, creating a network of transformation that spread across the town. Mark Thompson understood before the others, his years in the forest having taught him to recognize patterns that others missed. "They're not gathering to fight," he explained, watching as reality continued to shift and flow around them. "They're coming together to protect something that's trying to emerge." The transformed animals moved with increasing synchronization, their forms becoming more abstract, more pure energy than matter. Each movement left traces in the air like mathematical equations written in light, describing principles of reality that human science had barely begun to grasp. Through their enhanced consciousness, they projected images and concepts that expanded human understanding, showing glimpses of a universe far more complex and interconnected than anyone had imagined. Dr. Martinez worked frantically to document everything, though her instruments could barely process what they were detecting. "The energy patterns are becoming more organized," she reported, her voice filled with academic wonder. "It's as if the animals are creating a new language, not just for communication, but for restructuring reality itself." Emily felt the weight of the moment as she watched the reality anchor charge to full power. The transformation wasn't something that could be controlled or contained. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself, a change that had been set in motion the moment Aurora had first appeared at her clinic. Fighting against it now would be like trying to stop the universe from expanding. The transformed animals gathered closer, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that made reality itself malleable. Through their enhanced consciousness, they shared visions of what was coming, not an ending, but an evolution, a shift in the very nature of being that would change everything they thought they knew about existence. Shadow moved to Emily's side, the husky's transformed form now existing in multiple states simultaneously. Through their shared consciousness, Emily could see what needed to happen next. Not a fight against the transformation, but an embrace of what it revealed about the true nature of existence. The question wasn't how to stop what was happening, but how to help it unfold in a way that wouldn't tear reality apart at the seams. As the reality anchor reached critical power levels, Emily made her decision. She couldn't let fear of the unknown destroy something beautiful just because it wasn't understood. The transformation wasn't a threat to be contained. It was an opportunity to see the world as it really was, in all its wonderful complexity. The moment of truth arrived with the first rays of dawn, painting Cedar Grove in colors that existed beyond normal human perception. Dr. Emily Parker stood between the military's reality anchor and the gathered transformed animals, her decision made as reality itself trembled on the edge of fundamental change. The massive device hummed with dangerous energy, its attempt to enforce normal physics, creating visible distortions in the fabric of space-time. Colonel Hayes watched from his command center as warning lights flashed across every monitor. "The reality anchor is at full power," he announced, his voice tight with tension. "Once activated, there's no going back. Everything within its radius will be forced back into standard physical laws." The colonel's hands hovered over the activation controls, his military training warring with the incredible scenes unfolding. Before him, through the quantum interference, Emily could see the transformed animals moving with perfect synchronization, their forms now more energy than matter. Shadow led them in geometric patterns that matched the designs from Aurora's fur, each movement adding to a growing field of pure possibility that pushed against the military's attempts to lock down existence. Dr. Rachel Martinez's instruments sparked and smoked as they tried to measure phenomena that transcended conventional physics. "The quantum readings are off any scale we've ever designed," she reported, her laboratory coat now permanently altered by exposure to the transformation field. "The animals aren't just resisting the reality anchor, they're using its energy to catalyze something entirely new." Mark Thompson arrived with the last pieces of evidence they needed, his ranger uniform shimmering with interdimensional energy. "The Forest Service satellites are showing something remarkable," he explained, displaying images that seemed to move on their own. The transformation patterns match ancient geometric designs found all over the world. This isn't just change, it's awakening. Dr. David Chen worked frantically at his monitoring station, watching as reality fluctuations intensified around the reality anchor. The energy signatures are evolving beyond anything we can measure, he muttered, making notes that curve through multiple dimensions. We're not just dealing with physical transformation anymore. This is fundamental change at the level of existence itself. Emily felt the familiar resonance of Aurora's influence growing stronger. Not the creature itself, but the change it had initiated. The air filled with patterns that described principles beyond human science, showing how the transformations were part of a larger process of universal evolution. Each new development revealed more of what her mysterious patient had tried to show her, that reality was far more flexible and extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The crystal at the center of the clinic pulsed with increasing urgency, its light creating interference patterns that revealed the true nature of what was happening. Each pulse showed more of the universe's underlying structure, demonstrating how the transformations weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper principles that had always existed. Jasper materialized beside Emily, the Siamese. Cat's form now resembling a living equation that solved itself in real time. Through enhanced consciousness, the transformed animal shared visions of what the reality anchor would really do, not stabilize existence, but strip it of the complexity and wonder that made it real. The military's solution would reduce reality to a simple, rigid state that couldn't support the kind of life the universe was trying to become. As the reality anchor charged to full power, its energy field spreading like a wave of enforced normality, more transformed animals arrived. They came from all directions: dogs that walked through quantum probability clouds, cats that existed in multiple states simultaneously, birds that flew in patterns that rewrote the laws of physics. Each one carried something, objects that resonated with the same energy as the crystal, creating a network of transformation that spread across the town. Emily stepped forward, her voice carrying across the distorted space between her and Colonel Hayes. "You have to stop this," she urged, gesturing to the impossible beauty unfolding around them. "The transformation isn't something we need to fear or control. It's showing us what's always been true about reality, that it's far more wonderful and complex than we ever imagined." The colonel hesitated, his finger over the activation switch as he watched the transformed animals move in patterns that defied comprehension, yet held undeniable purpose. Through the quantum interference, everyone present could see glimpses of what the universe was trying to become, something far more extraordinary than their limited understanding could contain. Dr. Elizabeth Warner removed her protective gear, her scientific training finally yielding to direct observation. "This isn't a threat to be contained," she announced, watching as reality continued to rewrite itself around them. "It's an evolution, one that we need to understand and accept, rather than fight against." The transformed animals gathered closer, their combined presence creating a field of pure possibility that made reality itself malleable. Through their enhanced consciousness, they shared visions of what was coming, not an ending, but an evolution, a shift in the very nature of being that would change everything they thought they knew about existence. Shadow moved to Emily's side, the Husky's transformed form now existing in multiple states simultaneously. Through their shared consciousness, Emily could see what needed to happen next. Not a fight against the transformation, but an embrace of what it revealed about the true nature of existence. The question wasn't how to stop what was happening, but how to help it unfold in a way that wouldn't tear reality apart at the seams. As tension reached its peak, something extraordinary happened. The crystal at the center of the clinic began to resonate with the objects the other animals had brought, creating harmonies that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. Each resonance revealed new layers of reality, showing how the transformations weren't random mutations, but the emergence of something that had always existed beneath the surface of ordinary existence. The military's containment field crackled and sparked as it encountered waves of pure possibility radiating from the transformed animals. Equipment designed to measure and control reality began to transform itself, becoming part of the change it was meant to prevent. The reality anchor's rigid energy field met the fluid nature of evolved existence, creating a moment of perfect balance between what was and what could be. In that crucial moment, Emily understood what Aurora had been trying to show her all along. The transformation wasn't just about animals evolving beyond their physical forms. It was about the universe itself waking up, becoming aware of its own infinite potential. Through the enhanced consciousness of the transformed creatures, everyone present could see glimpses of what reality really was. A living, breathing thing that couldn't be contained by human understanding. Colonel Hayes watched as his carefully planned containment strategy dissolved in the face of something far more powerful than military technology. The reality anchor's attempt to enforce normal physics instead revealed more of the extraordinary nature of existence, showing how their efforts to maintain control had actually helped catalyze the very change they sought to prevent. The transformed animals moved with increasing purpose, their forms becoming more pure energy than matter. Each movement left traces in the air like living mathematics, describing principles of existence that transcended human understanding. Through their enhanced consciousness, they projected visions of what was coming, not destruction, but transformation on a scale that would change everything. As dawn painted the sky in impossible colors, the transformation reached its culmination. The crystals pulsing merged with the energy of the gathered animals, creating a field of pure possibility that spread outward in geometric patterns of light. Reality itself seemed to take a deep breath, and in that moment of perfect clarity, everyone present understood what needed to happen. Colonel Hayes lowered his hand from the reality anchor's controls, accepting that some changes couldn't and shouldn't be stopped. The military's equipment powered down as the transformed animals' dance reached its peak, their combined consciousness showing visions of a universe far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The transformation spread like ripples in a cosmic pond, changing not just the animals, but the very nature of reality itself. The boundaries between possible and impossible became fluid, revealing a world where consciousness and matter were different expressions of the same underlying truth. Through this evolution, Cedar Grove became a window into what the universe could become when allowed to express its full potential. Up next, on your screen, 2 more incredible tales await your discovery. If this story of transformation and wonder captured your imagination, you won't want to miss what comes next. Click now to continue your journey into the extraordinary.